It's been impressive energy throughout. We'll see how the week unfolds here at NATO. Interesting aligning three different innovation cultures. You have Silicon Valley, DoD, and NATO. That's what I'm here to talk to this distinguished panel about. Aditi, I wanted to start with you about how you're getting on the same page across these three different lanes. You have Silicon Valley and DC getting acquainted with DIU. How do you throw NATO into that mix?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. Thank you for listening. So, we are in the midst of implementing our DIU 3.0 strategy, and it is a very exciting time for DIU. Obviously, we've built these relationships with the tech sector for many years, and it's now time for us to scale and show that we can, integrate the latest technology into U.S. Military forces, and then working with our allies and partners as well. So I have the privilege of leading our global partnerships portfolio, which is one of the main tenets of our DIU 3.0 strategy. And we're doing a few things to really invest in our global relationships. The first is direct relationships with ministries of defense, NATO countries being our foremost partners. And we are doing a variety of things with them, including joint accelerators where we're putting firms, U.S. firms, international firms through programming, getting them used to working not only with the DoD, but our partner ministries of defense. We are putting embeds into other ministries of defense and welcoming them into ours, and so we can have closer ties and work on projects together. And we're creating direct opportunities for firms. We are using our commercial solutions opening process, which DIU has leveraged for many years to bring in new technologies and new entrants into the DoD in a low-cost, low-barrier way. CSOs are open to international firms. And in fact, we have awarded to 27 companies across 10 countries in past years. And so we're trying to deepen those relationships, making sure that we're getting those CSO opportunities out so that we can do more work with the tech ecosystems, not just domestically, but globally as well.
Andrea, one of the things we were talking about backstage is you're trying to accelerate the number of NATO countries that are actually involved in innovation. You have 24. You'd like to get to all of the alliance, 32. Is NATO's adoption of commercial tech moving fast enough, and what should the innovation priorities look like for the alliance?
So obviously one important piece is procurement policies. So at the NATO Innovation Fund, we are building an adoption team that helps our portfolio company sell into the 24 current allies investors in our fund. And obviously interoperability is a big theme for us and our portfolio company, and standardization of procurement and rapid procurement. NATO is developing a new initiative around rapid procurement for young technology companies and startups to be adopted faster. And we are looking forward to inputting that initiative and to drive our portfolio companies through that new path and to accelerate adoption for them.
And the other issue we were talking about is how do you prevent those companies as they're in the growth phase from getting snapped up by Chinese adversarial capital?
Correct. One of our key drivers, or one of our key goals, is what we call protect. Protect meaning protecting the IP of the companies we invest in from adversarial capital. So when we invest, we do a lot of work with our portfolio company to make sure that there is no adversarial capital involved in the company, and making sure that we put in place procedures and policies to protect this intellectual property and this product to be basically transferred to adversary capital.
Brandon, I know you're meeting with some European partners, companies on the sidelines of this NATO summit. In the past several years, we've seen the U.S. really expand new entrants in the defense field in a big way. Do you see that same defense tech ecosystem mobilizing in Europe as you've seen these calls for more entrants to get involved?
I think it's to be determined still in terms of how it's going to play out in Europe. It is a very different capital ecosystem than the United States. The United States benefits from having a venture capital ecosystem that is much larger than any other system on the planet, and that really benefits entrepreneurs, young companies. And when you look at the technology sectors that are going to make a difference in defense, and I think about two, it's the combination of software and low-cost hardware, low-cost drones. The United States obviously has a premier software ecosystem as well, and that's because we have a premier venture capital ecosystem. And so that is, I think you're still going to see a lot coming out of that U.S. ecosystem, and it's nascent in Europe. Certainly Europe has its wins in terms of the companies that it has produced, but it's just a very different ecosystem. So I think we're still in early innings. Obviously, I think it's good for NATO. I think it's good for the United States. I think it's good for everybody to have that environment, but it's certainly more of an uphill battle when you don't have those when you don't have that system in place already.
Is there a valley of death in Europe, some equivalent to what we see in the United States?
Oh yeah, yeah. There's a valley of death in Europe. There's a valley of death in the United States. It's any democratic country generally has a valley of death in terms of, because I think they've all mimicked the U.S. acquisition process, which is not what I would recommend in terms of how we buy things, right? And I think it's something DIU is trying to certainly disrupt and figure out how we can buy things differently. But because you have all these countries replicating how the United States has bought things in the past, you have valley of deaths in near all Western democracies.
Fair, and I want to get to Aditi in a second, but Andrea, where you sit, do you agree with that characterization? Is that something that you see as you're looking for more companies to get into rapid procurement in NATO?
I mean, I often make the comparison, having invested in deep tech for 25 years, that to be honest with you, the value of that exists in most deep tech sectors, probably software being the only exception. I've invested in medtech company where there is a huge value of that to be adopted by the large national health services. In the telecom world, if you want to sell to some of the largest mobile or fixed operators, you have to go through 2-3 years of testing. So I think it's just an element of how you build a deep tech business. The procurement patterns are different by industry, but they're still very long. When you have critical infrastructure and critical strategic technologies, the buyer, particularly when it is a very sophisticated buyer, whether it is in healthcare or the defense world, it just takes a long time, whether it is certification, development, integration, and adoption. So to me, it's just a phase of development of a company.
Aditi, one thing that queued you up in DIU earlier in the conversation is buying things differently, looking at procurement acquisition processes. One thing I'm curious about is, as we sort of have this conversation transatlantically about the arsenal of democracy, you have 23 out of 32 NATO countries now at 2%. I guess, what does that mean from an innovation standpoint? Do you see these countries innovating? Do you see them spending money on the right things? Do you see them fixing their processes? Or are they just spending money after the same old bad processes?
I mean, we're having very productive conversations with our counterparts on how we bridge the many valleys of death that exist, not just in DoD, but in their ministries as well. And you're right, the challenges are common. And I think one of the benefits of this alliance is that we can work on those together in a very tight-knit way. And so, one learning has been, how do we get the agile, rapid acquisition processes into all of our MODs? But it doesn't stop there, right? As Brandon and others know, the valleys are multiple, and they follow basically every process that the capability has to go through to get to the warfighter. So if you're not working with your combatant commanders to develop a concept of operations that makes sense, you're not going to get acquired at scale. If you're not working with the joint staff and with research and engineering to make sure that the experimentation schedule is accelerated on time, gets the results, your reports get to the company in time, and they're making the necessary upgrades, you're not going to get procured at scale. So there are so many different processes that need to be aligned along the way. And that's what DIU is trying to do across the whole life cycle, and that's what we're partnering with other ministries to do across the NATO alliance, is how do we share those lessons learned, how do we use our personnel exchanges, our best practices to make sure that we're all fixing those types of issues together.
One thing that NATO, of course, has been doing in the lead up to the summit as they're developing war plans is going around and getting countries in line with the capabilities requirements. Do you see sort of a parallel in tech? Should there be requirements for development of new tech, for setting requirements for innovation, those sorts of things? Should that be baked into that process, or is that too prescriptive?
I think we need to build flexibility into the system, absolutely. I think the requirements that we specify need to be warfighter-centric, and I think that means that we're making room for cutting-edge technology to make it into the system, and we're working with the engines of scale in each of our respective departments to make sure that the buyer is there at the other end, is willing to make those upgrades. And this is where I think the hardware-software issue that you started to talk about, Brandon, becomes really important, right? So how do we invest in hardware that makes sense for all of us, but then do acquisition in a way where we're allowing software upgrades in the way that our capabilities can stay ahead of the curve and meet the warfighter need? And one example of that is in the unmanned aerial system space that Brandon knows well. How do we create the right mechanisms to make sure that what the Ukrainians are seeing, which is the tech needs to be updated every 90 days or even sooner, that we're staying abreast of that cycle? I think those are the types of conversations that we should be having in terms of how do you bake in innovation into your acquisition cycle.
But it sounds like, and Brandon, I'm curious to get your take, it sounds like countries in the NATO alliance aren't as nimble even as the Ukrainians in doing those, pushing those software updates, doing those types of things.
Yeah, and a couple of things there. One, I'm very much, if you've ever heard me talk about this, I'm very much against the requirements process. I think it should be thrown out, trashed, the entire thing, day one, right? It's the old saying, if you asked Henry Ford what people wanted, they would have said faster horses, right? Horses that can go farther. They're not asking for a car. What entrepreneurs do, what companies do, is they want to know your problems, and then they want to come up with solutions to solve your problems. And so I think that needs to be that's a policy challenge in the U.S., in NATO, abroad, because every country is always, they're fundamentally set on the requirements process, and all these countries, all you guys are getting are faster horses, right? And so that's why I say just throw it out, start with a different acquisition process that is problem-centric, that's problem-based first and foremost. And then just a quick go back. I think it is important to recognize, I don't think Europe should try and replicate what is going on in the United States as it relates to defense technology, as it relates to, it'd be taking on the United States as it relates to software development and AI development is a monumental challenge where we are investing hundreds of billions of dollars. What I think, honestly, in terms of what needs to happen is Europe needs to look at Europe-centric problems and say, what's the best way to actually solve these problems? Where can we actually, drive speciality? Because otherwise, you're just going to get protectionist policies, protectionist regulations, where you're not going to end up with the best capability for your military. And that would be my principal concern of Europe trying to just replicate what's going on here in the United States rather than specialize for the problems that are centric to their market and that need to be solved in their market.
Well, speaking of faster,
and where they can leverage partners like the U.S. or partners, abroad in Asia, in the Middle East, et cetera.
Speaking of Henry Ford and faster horses, I guess we'll see if NATO makes any upgrades to its cavalry at this summit. Not expected, but one thing I'm curious about, Andrea, is we hear a lot of talk out of the alliance, especially the Nordic countries, about resilience, about being ready for war, about readying the entire society for war. And indeed, it seems like the NATO countries may put something forward to that regard at the summit. When you look at the tech ecosystem, how do you mobilize? How do you prepare for war? How do you prepare for an Article 5 across that type of portfolio?
We're already seeing entrepreneurs reacting to that. So our key themes is deep tech, addressing defense, security, and resilience. Some of the key areas where we're seeing this issue because of what happened recently is energy resilience. And we're looking at multiple technology, for example, that are addressing the electricity grid resilience. We're looking at resilience of supply chains and many others. This is one of the key areas where entrepreneurs are already seeing a potential need and a market demand, and they are starting companies to fulfill that future need.
One thing, Aditi, that you've been working on very closely at DIU is the replicator program, and obviously Ukraine has changed the defense tech ecosystem quite a bit in terms of countries wanting to field cheaper, larger swarms of drones. Is there a relevance of sort of these types of initiatives that DoD is working on towards Europe? Because, of course, some of the things that you're working on at DIU very closely map to the Indo-Pacific, but just curious about the relevance in this theater.
It is absolutely relevant and, in fact, informed by the lessons that we're learning in real time, unfortunately, in Ukraine. So absolutely, we are integrating. We have DIU personnel in EUCOM that are embedded there that are feeding us information about what is working. We're learning a lot about the types of contested environments that we face today and are likely to face in the future, and learning about what the department needs to do to be prepared for that. So how do we think about resilient communications? How do we think about collaborative autonomy in these settings? How do we build, I mean, a lot of these capabilities are pushing the frontier of what we have done in the past. And so I think Replicator is definitely helping us push the boundary forward. Replicator in and of itself is not going to be, the department's solution to all of autonomy. There's a lot of work going on across the department, and there's a lot of work going on with our NATO partners. I mean, the UK has its drone defense strategy. Other nations are pursuing similar efforts, and so the importance of unmanned systems in all domains cannot be underestimated. And I think that this alliance again is a good opportunity for us to take the lessons from the EUCOM theater and build and really push the frontier of technology.
Just keeping the focus sort of on Ukraine and collaboration between adversaries. We see, of course, the Chinese providing microchips to the Russians. We see sort of a collaborative ecosystem and a focus in China around civil-military fusion. Is there anything that worries you specifically about the way that China and Russia are approaching tech adoption? Are there ways that they're ahead of the curve? And is there any way that the alliance or the U.S. should be countering this?
Yeah, I think that we are taking a lot of the right steps. I mean, this is why initiatives like the NATO Innovation Fund are so important, right? We share the same goals, which is how do we protect our supply chains from adversary influence? How do we build those capabilities, not just domestically, but in our allies and partners? I think that is a huge focus of our effort. How do we grow our industrial base, and how do we create an ecosystem where we're giving the defense industrial base problems to solve rather than prescriptions, as Brandon said? Those are all efforts that DIU is pushing. And at the end of the day, I think, our focus is obviously commercial. How do we bring in commercial tech, dual use tech into the ecosystem? And I think that is where the U.S. and our allies and partners have a real edge. And that is where we should be investing. That is where we should be putting our energies, is to bring the best of our tech talent into the ecosystem.
Yeah, and certainly one thing I wanted to pose to the panel, Andrea, maybe, is just sort of the back and forth that we hear in Washington. I'm curious if this is mirrored in Brussels and European capitals as well, about sort of the failure to speed up innovation, speed up defense spending as quickly as possible. There's sort of a blame game that goes on. Government says industry is not taking enough risk, perhaps. Industry says that government's not making the needed investments. Who do you see sort of at fault here, as it seems like there's sort of a common trend in the conversations that things aren't moving fast enough?
I think there's been a bit of an awakening happening in the past maybe couple of years about defense being probably another area that we should look at from an investment point of view, like ESG and dual use, how it should be an investment category. So at the NIF, we work very hard with the European Investment Fund and the European Investment Bank to change the policy around dual use investing. So now they are allowing the fund that they invest in to do dual use investment, investing in defense technologies. These will attract, over the next 10 years, a lot of private capital, because these are the largest investor in VC funds in Europe, which will need to go and raise private capital. And these will trickle down to those companies that are building these technologies in defense, security, and resilience. So I think finally there is a waking up to the fact that we need to accelerate this investment. If we look what the Chinese government is doing from a top-down point of view, we need to be able to align all the incentive to replicate that as far as we can. And I think things are moving.
So there is a model that the Chinese and the Russians perhaps are providing on the adversarial side that the allies can build off of.
I wouldn't necessarily call it a model. I just think that they're showing how they're doing it much faster at a much bigger scale, and it has been a bit of awakening here in Europe for multiple governments to line up, invest in our fund, for example, and now the European Investment Fund following up with the change in policy.
Brandon, from where you sit in industry, sort of how do you see sort of that back and forth, the finger pointing between industry and government?
I don't think it's super productive to have finger pointing. I think both sides need to be solutions oriented. I do worry about China and their mobilization and allocation of resources, and how, as their governmental system can do that much faster than a Western bureaucracy, Western democracy can mobilize and allocate resources. And I fundamentally believe the United States and the West, our allies, NATO, we need to be moving farther ahead, faster. I think about World War II. The Germans discovered nuclear fission was possible December 1938. In 1940s, we started mobilizing against the Manhattan Project. $30 billion later, and 4 years later, obviously, we launched the atomic bomb and set the world order for the next 80 years. My concern is that China, that nuclear fission moment has already happened, right? I would claim we were flying AI-piloted drones in 2018 inside buildings without GPS, without communications, without people. We were flying F-16s in 2022 without people, fully AI-piloted drones. And if China, has their wits about them and says, great, let's mobilize our resources, let's allocate our resources to this problem, right? That's what I worry about, the U.S. not moving fast enough on a technology that is going to set the world order for the next 80 years. Not just the U.S., the West, right, including NATO as our allies.
Well, and that's sort of a challenge. NATO operates on unanimity, right? How do you get 32 allies in the room to agree on common approach here?
I don't think you can get all 32 to say this is exactly what we need to do, but there needs to be high-level buy-in and people can appoint, a leader to lead in this space and say, look, we're going to supercharge efforts here. We all agree that's important for the West to lead in AI and autonomy. We believe in Western values. That's what brings all of us together in this room, and believe in a world that is led by Western values versus a world that is led by a value system that is, that I think we all have challenges with. That's how I think you can mobilize it, right? We've done it in the past. In World War II, we did it. It's not an impossible thing to do. It is challenging, but you have to find, and you have to, every country has to realize the importance of it and say, you know what, let's move forward on this.
Aditi, I know we sort of touched on it with the replicator initiative a little bit, but I'm just curious, as Ukraine has overshadowed, of course, this whole conference already with the horrible attack that we saw earlier today. I'm curious, with the changes in the battlefield that we see on Ukraine just happening so rapidly from week to week, month to month even, how is the change in that ecosystem impacting the overall innovation ecosystem that you're looking at?
So I think it's putting more definition on the problems that we're trying to solve. As I mentioned earlier, one of the learnings is that we need to stay ahead of the tech curve, and things shift in terms of the environment and the way that it's contested very quickly. So how do we stay ahead of that, not only from a tech perspective, but from an acquisition perspective? I think the cost curves are remarkably low for some of our adversaries. So going back to your earlier questions of things that worry me about China and Russia. So when we're going up against capabilities that are in the tens of thousands of dollars, and we've got some of these systems that are many multiples of that, that's just not a favorable equation for us to sustain, right? And so how do we drive towards those types of solutions? And then how do we look just beyond our own tech ecosystem to work with allies and partners and work with Ukraine? How do we build up their tech ecosystem, because they will need to have these capabilities domestically to sustain their own efforts? Those are all problems that have crystallized through the course of this conflict that we're now really focused on.
Well, and then how do you solve the people problem too? Because it seems like the Ukrainians have been very successful putting IT specialists right into military units. Is that a model that the U.S. could be thinking about?
Yeah, to broaden that framing a little bit, how do you make sure that you're getting feedback real time from the warfighter back into the acquisition system through whatever mechanism?
Yeah. Well, Andrea, anything else that you're looking for at this NATO summit? Brandon, anything that you guys are looking for that could speed up the innovation trajectory within the alliance here?
Well, I think we talked about it. I think faster adoption, more streamlined procurement is really what I'm hoping that is going to be on the table for this summit.
Brandon?
I would echo that. You'll never hear me not saying slow down. Always faster, faster, faster. And I think people need to have that sense of urgency. People have to create that sense of urgency. What matters is, what's going on right now, right? If you are already in an active conflict like Ukraine, Russia, you're coming from behind. And so when I think about NATO in Europe, when I think about the Indo-Pacific, what matters is what you do in peacetime. What matters is the capabilities that you build, because you don't want to be building those capabilities during wartime. It's a 10x harder problem to do. It's much rather solve that problem before it becomes a problem.
Well, let's see how it goes this week. Thanks so much to the panel for a wonderful discussion. Thank you.